chapters are called either fountain or portrait, depending on whose point of view. Fountain is the contemporary, and portrait, of course, is the French Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who lived from 1755 to 1842. She lived to her mid-80s, very unusual for a woman of that kind. Partly because, of course, she was devoted to her art, and she got such satisfaction, such affirmation from her art. Okay, here we go. What a lovely flower this is. I don't know how this got here, but my thanks to whoever. So, thank you. It's beautiful. No matter, it was almost midnight. She would deliver her manuscript herself. A lopsided moon hunched high overhead. She hesitated between the fluted columns of her porch. It was dark, it was late, it was chilly, and prepared to make her way carefully down the semicircular steps toward the fountain. In the crook of her arm, she cradled the printout of her new book, swaddled in a large white envelope. Warmth from the just minted pages passed through the envelope and through the gray sleeve of her sweater to her forearm. The envelope's flap stood open, and the manuscript murmured to its author, "Alive, alive-o." Her manuscript's small, assuring voice might have provided a descant to the cascade rushing over the brim of the fountain's high chalice, but the falling waters brooked no song but its own. By night, by day, the fountain, surmounted by a sculpture of Venus rising from the sea, was preeminent on St. James Court. A bronze scarf billowed around the figure's back and modestly covered her loins in front. Whether the fountain waters sang of dark midnight or of its own well-illumined being, Catherine was unsure. Under the gibbous moon, a few bright windows shone among the Victorian houses of St. James Court, along with a scattering of dim porch lights. Old-fashioned gas lamps set at a height that a man on a short ladder might have reached flickered around the edges of a 2-block swath of wide, grassy median. In a circular break in the green, the illumined fountain and its falling waters suggested a lantern emanating a golden haze. If I were a moth, Catherine thought. But she thought the fountain is not a lantern, and I am not a moth. She began the descent from her porch, her eyes fixed on the figure of Venus. The emblem of love and beauty shone like a bright candle. Not a moth, not a moth. Yet Catherine had written something about moths in her book, and they had escaped to flutter around her head. Perhaps she was a moth, or had been a moth, to the bright ideal of marriage. Or was it to the purifying ritual of divorce? Catherine glanced down at the warm bundle she carried in the crook of her arm. While her manuscript titled Portrait of the Artist as an Old Woman was based on the 18th century French portrait painter, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the book had promised its author to be a looking glass, albeit streaked, clouded, and freckled by imagination, in which the author might glimpse revelatory images of herself. Though almost old, Catherine Callahan still hoped to learn from her mistakes. She paused behind the fountain to regard the backside of Venus, the rush of water falling in a perfect circle from the rim of the chalice. What did it signify, after all, this historical novel she was calling Portrait of the Artist as an Old Woman? Perhaps something about loss, and the self-serving mirror image of loss named gain. But did anyone want to read about an old woman, about an artist, living or dead? Of course, Ernest Hemingway had managed very well with his short tale, The Old Man and the Sea, and then James Joyce's portrait of an artist, admittedly male and young to boot, had dominated creative imaginations for 100 years. Recently divorced, the third time, Catherine felt vulnerable, a creature emerging from the snug walls of her library into damp, autumnal realities. Tonight especially, her skin felt raw, abraded by the backwash of divorce. She pulled her sweater a little closer to her body. At midnight, October air in Louisville was predictably damp and chilly, she told herself, not an omen. Was it possible Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun's sustaining knowledge she had lived most happily to age 85, had been about neither loss nor gain, but about some other nebulous abstraction, something about love or art. Like dimly lit windows in the distance, ideas caught the edge of her attention for a moment, then went out. Her discontinuous thoughts were displaced by a flare of joy from the center of herself. Catherine's nearly lifelong friend, soon to be the manuscript's first and most astute reader, had recently moved on to St. James Court. Yes, his midnight mission was to deliver her manuscript to Leslie. For the first time since Catherine's Alabama childhood, friendship could be accessed just across the street. As Catherine considered the cascading waters of the fountain, she fingered the thick edge of the stack of papers within the yet open envelope and made a wish, not for herself, but for her newborn novel. Be accessible. Accessible. It was a word that needed to stand in the middle of the street and pant ecstatically for its own breath. Be as accessible, as beautiful, as variously meaningful. How much did she dare wish? Be as accessible as this fountain, giving pleasure in myriad ways to anyone who might regard it. Be accessible, my poetry.